mind is all at sea. Then cease the useless tedium and brew a cup of tea. There is magic in its fragrance, there is solace in its taste, and the laden moments vanish somehow into space. And the world becomes a lovely thing. There's beauty, as you'll see, all because you briefly stopped to take a cup of tea. This simple cup of tea has been fascinating the world for nearly 5,000 years. Ever since a Chinese emperor discovered it in his garden, tea has been inspiring and influencing nearly every culture that has taken up the cup. So much so that it is the second most popular beverage in all the world, second only to water itself. Now, tea claims quite a remarkable history in order to take its place gracing our table today. Its tale is steeped in many exotic and exciting places, customs, and cultures. And it is my pleasure to spend this tea time with you this afternoon as we look at what I consider one of the most fascinating chapters of tea's history. We're going to talk about the social history of tea at the turn of the 19th century. And more specifically, we're going to talk about what it would have been like to have taken tea with Jane Austen. So what we're going to, through the course of our short time together, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of tea, the habits of the tea table, and it will be specifically for that time period, and then finally the heart of the tea table, what it has always been about and certainly what it is about today. But before we talk about what it would have been like to take tea in Jane Austen's time, we need to do a little bit of reflection about what it's like to take tea in our own. So you'll find that it's remarkably different, and what I'd like to do is to draw you into another time period and another perspective on home life, on mealtime, and the social customs of taking tea. If you're like a typical American, you probably have a box of tea somewhere in your cupboards. You probably purchased it at a local grocery store without really thinking that it was going that you would have to spend a lot of money for it. And probably on that box of tea would be emblazoned the word Lipton. And inside you would find what Jane Austen would have no idea really what they were, but tea bags. Most likely it didn't cost you up to 2 weeks' income to pay for that simple box of tea. And just as unlikely that when your friends came over that you wouldn't run to the cupboard, pull out that box of Lipton tea to really impress them with what you had. And if you were to make a cup of tea today, you would be able to choose from basically 3 technological wonders in order to make your tea. The first would be a tea kettle on the electric stove. The second might be, what I have today, is an electric hot pot or an electric kettle. And the third way of making your tea, which perhaps some of us have had to resort to from time to time, is the mug in the microwave. All of those would have been completely foreign to Jane Austen. We'll talk about how she prepared a cup of tea, and you'll find that it was far different. And lastly, when you made your cup of bagged tea, and you had that waterlogged tea and just merely tossed it into the trash can, I don't think that you would have thought that any of your friends of a little bit lesser stature would have followed you and taken that bag out to reuse it in their own home. But this is just giving you a little glimpse into the fact that taking tea in Jane Austen's time was very different than our own. We take a lot of things for granted, and certainly tea might become a very ordinary thing for us to be able to just have and to enjoy. But it was much more of a valuable commodity and an extraordinary opportunity to have tea in Jane Austen's time. Jane Austen was born in 1775 in the county of Hampshire in England. She was born into a world in which tea was at the very center of domestic, social, economic, and political life. And when you think about it, what was happening in 1775, in our country, George Washington himself was taking tea, and 2 years earlier, in 1773, we had, of course, our famous Boston Tea Party, because America was deeply entrenched with tea-taking, so much so that we would go to war over that tea tax. A little bit more involved, but it did revolve around tea, for certain. I don't think there is another culture on earth that has been more influenced by tea than England herself. In fact, it's nearly impossible to think about the country without thinking about their unswerving devotion to tea. And we can see it well represented in Jane Austen's time. Well, tea came to Europe at the beginning of the 17th century, in the early 1600s, and that was due to the fact that we had improved navigation and shipbuilding, so all the rare commodities of the world ended up on the shores of England. And some of the most popular items were exotic beverages like coffee, cocoa or chocolate, and tea. But by far, tea was the favorite of the English. And you might be wondering, and this is true of course in America, what did they take before they had tea? Because the quality of water was very poor. Does anyone know what they would have had before tea? With their beer, hard cider, apple, we would call apple cider, but it was hard cider, very fermented. So you can see this genteel custom of taking tea. It was very healthy, and it was great because it exchanged alcohol for tea. So it was in the mid-1600s, about 1650, that tea first appeared in the coffee houses of London. And the coffee houses were a great place for men to gather and have conversation, and where a lot of the political discussions were held. But coffee houses were no place for ladies. So at that time, you could also buy tea in an apothecary because it was a very healthful drink. But ladies would take their tea at home. And certainly when it came out, it was very expensive. And over 100 years later, when Jane Austen took her tea, it was still a very expensive commodity. Now, King Charles in 1662 married a Portuguese wife, and her name was Catherine of Braganza. And she was the first tea-taking queen. So we can see the origin of most all of the genteel habits of society come from royalty. And so we see in the mid-1600s that tea becomes the fashion in the royal homes of Europe and particularly of England. And oftentimes you will see portraits during that time where you would have your family portrait painted with your tea service, because it showed you were very elegant, you were very wealthy, to not only to be able to afford tea, but everything that was associated with it. Fine tea wares, furniture, tea caddies, all types of things were created for this new, wonderful, expensive beverage called tea. And also, right before Jane Austen was born, they would have had tea gardens where enjoying tea would have been taken from the home sphere into more of the public sphere, where people could rub shoulders with others of different classes of society. It became a very social and a very elegant pastime to have tea gardens. Now, when would Jane Austen would have taken tea? So we're talking now in the late 1700s taking tea. Now we, as Americans, are very familiar with afternoon tea. But afternoon tea was not even invented yet. The afternoon tea did not come until about the 1840s, so we're talking about the late 1700s. And to more fully understand the social life and customs of the time, I I think we have to talk about the rhythm of mealtimes. Tea would have been taken in a very strict time of day. Not like today where we will brew a cup of tea basically any time of day. In her day, it would have been taken either in the morning at breakfast or in the evening after dinner. And that was true for everyone. They took it, if they could afford it, they would have it in the morning and in the evening. There was no really such thing as a lunchtime. And so as evening meals became later, you can see that everyone would be getting hungry in the afternoon, and that's actually how afternoon tea was started, because they needed something else to eat in the middle of the day. But what I have displayed for you is actually a breakfast set, something like Jane Austen could have had, and she would have had it in the morning with her breakfast. Whether you were having tea in the morning or in the evening, you would basically be having the same things with tea, and that would be some sort of bread. Whether it was toast, could have been scones, muffins, tea breads, butter, and as I have displayed here, eggs came as well, that you might have those at breakfast. But that is generally what people would have with their tea. And if you do have any questions throughout my talk, please feel free to ask questions. Jane would have had tea at about 9 o'clock in the morning. As you became more elegant and more fashionable, they were a middle-class family, so they weren't of the upper crust of society, but you see the more well-to-do people pushing their breakfast hour later and their dinner hour later. But in the morning is when Jane would have written letters, gone shopping, done some reading. So because they did not have electricity, they needed to make the most of their daylight hours. So you will find that they did many activities before their breakfast, which was about 9 or 10 o'clock. And it was actually Jane's responsibility to make tea in the morning, or it could have been in the evening. You will never find a servant making tea. It was always the privilege of the ladies of the house to make tea. Now, Jane didn't have running water. She would have had to have gotten her water, probably a servant would have drawn it from the well. And they didn't have electricity, so in order for her to make her tea, she would have needed to make it in the hearth. So it would have been, a wood fire, and there are actually books that do talk about it. While I did borrow a book from the library, there's one called Jane Austen's World that is excellent on Jane Austen's time. But also, here's another one written by an English woman called The Social History of Tea, which is an excellent book, as well as the Tea with Jane Austen. And I don't think I brought my copy here, but this is the book that some very fortunate person is going to win today. Is an excellent resource on what it was like to take tea during Jane Austen's time. But she would have prepared tea in her copper kettle and put it over what they describe as their hob grate into the hearth to boil her tea. Now, because we do have the modern inventions and it was really too much to lug all of the wood and build a fire for you, we're going to do it this way. So she would have heated her water that was from the well over the fire. She would have gotten her tea out of what is called a tea caddy. I don't have their antiques now, but they would have had a lock on it, and the mistress of the house, the lady of the house, would carry her keys with her, probably to the doors, the various doors and cabinets of her home, but also to her tea caddy. She would have had a key. Now, what type of tea would Jane Austen have enjoyed? Now, while today we know that there are over 3,000 varieties of tea available that all come from a single plant called the Camellia sinensis, when Jane went to London to purchase her tea, she would have had about 12 varieties of tea to choose from. And basically the two that you can think of are black tea and green tea. These were two of the most popular teas available. And today what I'm going to make is actually a green tea. And the gunpowder tea, which is hand-rolled. It's a green tea that's hand-rolled, and this is something that Jane Austen would certainly have had. She referred in the books that I've read, she either calls it tea or green tea, and most likely the tea she's referring to would be a black tea. Okay, now there are basically, I'll just, for your information, note there are 4 major types of tea. They all come from the same plant called the Camellia sinensis, but you've probably heard the names of these tea: white tea, green tea, oolong, and black tea. They're the 4 major categories. I haven't read anything that they had white tea, but they would have had the rest of them: green, oolong, and black. Now, where would Jane have purchased her tea? Unlike us, where we could just go to the local store and get a fairly good tea, Jane could have gotten her tea from the peddler, which would have been right outside her front door. She could have gone to her local town to find tea, or she could have gone to London. And to London is where Jane went to go to get tea, and she went to a specific warehouse called Twinings. And I don't know if any of you have traveled to England and have been to the Strand, it's called the Strand, or Strand, I should say, in London, and that's where she actually would have gone to purchase her tea. Tea bags did not exist, and packaged tea does not exist, so they would weigh out however much amount of tea that she wanted, and she usually bought it by the pound, and about 12 pounds at a time, so it must have been extremely expensive. And that's where she would have gotten her tea. Now, there were many other options for people to get tea, because at that time, poor people were drinking tea, all levels of society were having tea, but you could get tea really at any cost, because there was a lot of smuggling going on at the time, and tea could be very adulterated. They could add reused tea leaves, they could use bark. There were all kinds of horrendous things going on because there was such a high demand for tea. But the reason why Jane purchased her legal tea at Twinings is because it would have been the best quality, but she would have had to have paid a lot for it. Okay, how did Jane Austen take her tea? Now, I'm going to pause for a moment in Jane Austen's time to not only tell you about their time period, but also to demonstrate for you how to make tea today. And I'm going to use a glass teapot so you can see what's happening. But before me, I have a tea tray, which would have looked similar to Jane Austen's time and also reflects some of the Victorian additions. But usually you have on a tea tray 2 teapots, one to hold your tea and the second to hold hot water for those who take their tea weak. And also on the tea tray I have a sugar, a creamer, a tea strainer, which was introduced in the late 1700s. I don't know if she had one or not, but certainly some of the wealthy society would have a tea strainer. And then this is called, I don't know if anyone knows what this is called, but a slop basin or a slop bowl. So it's got a little bit of a vulgar name to it, but it is actually a very, very practical item on your tea tray. It's a waste bowl. So what I'm going to do first is to heat the pot. And you're going, as your water comes to a boil, you can just take some of that hot water and pour it into your teapot. And you can swirl it around. You just want to heat it because it is very important for you to have the right temperature of tea. Now today I'm going to be preparing green tea, which actually you don't want the water to come to a boil. You steep it just before the boil. But for black teas and oolong teas, you want it to come to a full boil, and that's all. You don't want it to keep on boiling because you'll lose oxygen in your water and it will make your tea taste flat. So if you have the custom at home of having a tea kettle on the stove and you boil the same water over and over again, and you find that your tea doesn't taste very nice. It could be because you have flat water, or if you have any impurities in your water and you can taste them in the drinking water, you're certainly going to taste them in your tea. So if you have gone to the trouble of purchasing some very nice tea, use either filtered water or bottled water. Okay, so I'm just going to pour this out, and then the general recipe for making tea is to use 1 teaspoon of tea for every cup that your teapot holds. Or if you're not making a full pot, then however many cups that you're making. And a lot of times you'll hear also, and 1 for the pot, an extra teaspoon of tea for the pot, which will make it more strong. I'm not going to make a full pot, but I'm going to add it directly into the teapot. And there are many other ways you can make tea. You can use a tea ball. There are tea socks, there are different types of infusers and baskets, but this is the most common way to make it, is putting it directly into the pot. Now this time I don't want it to boil. It's kind of just for green tea, just when you see the bubbles begin to appear. And then I'm going to pour it directly over the leaves, and there is a whole language associated with taking tea, and this is one of my favorite words. This is called the agony of the leaves, and you can imagine what happens when the tea is first hit by that very hot water. But this is where your caffeine is released, the color is released, and the flavor is also released. So this is green tea. Okay, while we're waiting for this to steep, and usually for green tea, it's about 3 minutes. Does anyone have any questions about what we've talked about, or preparing tea, or any of the history so far that I've talked about? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
When they started to take afternoon tea, what time was that?
It began about between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was by a lady in waiting. Her name was Anna of Bedford. She was a lady in waiting to Queen Victoria. So the invention of afternoon tea is merely moving the time that tea was taken from the late evening after dinner to earlier in the afternoon. They would have taken the same things with it: buttered bread, scones, something like that. So the English really didn't invent the whole meal, they invented the time that's associated with it. Does anyone else have any other questions? They would have dinner about, depending on the status of your family, it could be between 5 and 8 o'clock. And then they would take tea about 2 hours after. Well, dinner would last for 2 hours probably. And then they would retire. The men would stay at the table and discuss whatever men do say at the table, because women don't know what they talk about. The ladies would retire to the drawing room by themselves. They would order tea, and then later they would invite the men. So that could probably be as late as 9 or 10 o'clock. And if there were to have supper, which would consist merely of sandwiches, usually not tea, that could be as late maybe as 10 or 11 o'clock. So they didn't have the same meal scheme as we do today. Okay, here we have, we've finished with our tea steeping, and then I'll share with you just some of the general guidelines in serving tea. Now, because it is green tea, there would be no additions to green tea. You usually don't add milk or lemon. You would just have it what's called plain. If you have no additions to your tea, it would be plain. However, if you were serving a black tea with additions, you would ask your guest 2 questions. The first would be, how do you take your tea, strong or weak? If your guest takes it strong, then you would pour the cup 3/4 of the way full, and the tea goes in first. If it was weak, then you would only pour half full and add to the 3/4 cup with your hot water in your additional pot. So that's the first question. And then the second question would be with milk, sugar, or lemon. Now, Jane's preference for tea was with sugar. And sugar was a little different in her day from our own. They didn't have granulated sugar. They had white to brown sugar. Brown sugar would have been used by the lower class, and white sugar would have been used by the upper class, but it actually came in a cone. If you've ever been to a historic home, you may have seen cones of sugar, where they actually had sugar nippers, and they would have to nip sugar off of the cone and either put it in a bowl. But that's where we get the expression one lump or two, because they didn't have sugar cubes. They weren't invented until the 1850s, so they had sugar lumps. So that's where we get that expression from. So I'm going to go ahead and, would anyone like to have some green tea? Would anyone like to try the green tea? Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to you can give it a little swirl before you serve it. And I'll come to you with a tea strainer. So we're going to use a tea strainer. And all you simply do is put the tea strainer over your cup, and you're going to pour it right in. And it's as simple as that. Enjoy. And if you were to have additions with it, then you would add sugar first, because it's easier to dissolve because it's hot, and then your milk. And of course, you would never add lemon and milk at the same time. If you've done it once, you know not to do it again, because it will curdle. Now, here are just a couple of interesting things about the social or the etiquette of the period. If you had enough tea, and this is not true today, but you would either this was a silent signal that you had enough tea. You would put your spoon either in the cup or across it this spoon is a little large for it, but to signal you had enough tea. And also, one of the things that people did during that time, which is faux pas these days, the saucers looked more like bowls, and oftentimes there were handleless cups. But this is the way George Washington ate his tea, drank his tea, which reflects the period. He would pour the contents of the cup into the saucer and drink from the saucer. So I imagine in England they had their fair share of that too, but I haven't read any of the ladies have done that, but now it is not considered to be proper, certainly, to either put your spoon across your cup or to turn it over. You just say no thank you, as opposed to those silent signals. Does anyone have any questions about tea etiquette? You can certainly, I'll be available afterwards if you have any questions associated with that. Yes?
I read that putting milk in tea takes the goodness away.
There are different schools of thought on milk. Certainly there are some cultures that really enjoy milk with tea. So
I used to until I read that.
Yeah. Certainly the heartier teas, your English breakfast, Irish breakfast, Assam, Himam teas, they are a stronger tea, and they can become very tannic. And it is nice to put milk in it. The English definitely use milk in their tea. I haven't read that Jane Austen did that, but some of the lighter afternoon teas like Darjeeling or any of your herbal tisanes, you wouldn't add milk to it because it's too heavy for the delicate flavors of the tea. Yes?
Will you be touching on things like high tea at all?
I can explain what high tea. High tea is a Victorian working man's tea. It is actually not the genteel, highbrow afternoon tea that we commonly associate with it. It was taken at their dinner time, and they basically had tea with dinner. It's called high tea because it's served at a high table, your dinner table, rather than at a lower table or the tea table. So what is interesting, you can see tea taking throughout all classes of society, that everyone enjoyed it. And you didn't need a lot of money to enjoy it, depending on what kind of tea that you purchased, but everyone adopted some type of tea custom. Does anyone else have any questions? Yes.
If you're not using loose tea and you're using bags,
Yes.
how do you handle the bags?
Well, if you have a slop bowl, you can put them in your slop bowl or slop basin. I would remove them from the teapot after it's had its 5-minute or 4 to 5 minute steep, because it's going to make your tea tannic. But you can certainly use tea bags. They're easy to use. The quality of the tea may not be as good. Okay, so I just wanted to conclude with a few remarks that as we can see that tea taking in Jane Austen's day looks very different than our tea taking today. Running water and electricity have transformed the way that we make it. It's extremely affordable to us and available, and that we can enjoy it at all times of the day. We don't have to wait for breakfast. We don't have to wait for after dinner. It's certainly more convenient. However, when we think about it, a lot of things have remained the same about taking tea. It's a very social pastime. And I think it's even more glorious now to enjoy tea than then, because you don't have as many of the etiquette and rules associated with taking tea. You could just simply enjoy it. But we still have a ceremony associated with taking tea. We wouldn't go to all of this that we have today for coffee necessarily, or hot chocolate, or orange juice, or there's just a wonderful thing associated with taking tea, a wonderful ceremony and beauty surrounding it that I think is wonderful, that we definitely have maintained those attributes. So tea still brightens our mornings, and it still comforts our evenings. And I think tea today symbolizes, perhaps even in a greater way, hospitality and friendship. For tea brings us together, and it enhances our friendships. It provides the time and the place and the beautiful surroundings for significant conversation, and we'll be having that significant conversation soon when we talk about Emma. But also, it's a place for friendships to flourish. And when you think about your own life, if you're a tea drinker, that there are many wonderful times, many wonderful conversations that have occurred over cups of tea. And I think it's so needed in our society when we're in such a rush, and mealtime can be very difficult to have. But when we get together for tea, it's usually quiet. We usually bring out our most beautiful things, our most beautiful manners, and we really enjoy significant conversation in one another's company. For tea has much more than fine wares to impart. It's a time for connection, to share heart to heart. And I think that is the legacy of our tea table ever since it was introduced 5,000 years ago to today, that the same is true. So here concludes my portion of our discussion, and thank you very much.
I really enjoyed today's event so much. It was wonderful.
I thought the tea today was just absolutely superb. The food was delicious. The women who we had shortbread and some scones and all kinds of chocolate desserts. They were just scrumptious. And the tea, we had different sorts of teas to drink. Some herbal tea if you like that, or the Twinings, Earl Grey. It was just magnificent. Very restful and fun to be at.
Several events before, especially Jane Austen ones. I saw Emma, the movie, and Pride and Prejudice, and now the tea and the discussion. And I really enjoyed it.